Her hands were already trembling as the menu was placed on the table. She knew $15 would not be enough. Suddenly, the entire diner fell quiet. The silence was not about hunger, it was about the mafia boss who had just entered. When he learned how her husband died and who had stripped her of everything, he did not order a meal. He chose who would not see the next morning. If this story has captured you, please click the subscribe button to see what happens next. I am releasing another powerful story tomorrow. And before you go, drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. I enjoy seeing our global community. Now let's return to the story. Juliana Molina no longer knew what safety felt like. Just 6 months prior, she understood her place in the world. It was in a little house on Maple Street, with its faded blue shutters and a front porch that groaned under your weight. It was in a cozy bed beside her husband, hearing his steady breathing in the night. It was a life that, while not perfect, was entirely hers. Now, there was nothing. No home, no money, and no husband. She only had two small daughters who trusted their mother to keep them safe. She sat tucked away in a corner booth of the restaurant. Her olive green jacket was zipped all the way to her chin. The warmth inside made her sweat, but she refused to take it off. The shirt underneath was worn thin and stained. She could not allow anyone to notice. Chloe was pressed tightly against her left side, with her little hands resting in her lap. Palmer was on her right, her eyes fixed on the menu Juliana held in her shaking fingers. Both girls were in thin beige sweaters that were once soft, but now were covered in pills and frayed at the elbows. Their blonde hair was limp and needed combing. Their faces were pale, their eyes were too large, and they were far too alert for children their age. They understood not to ask for things. They understood that their mama's crying meant trouble. Juliana's gaze drifted over the laminated pages, but the text was a blur. Her vision narrowed, and her breathing became shallow. She added up the prices again and again, hoping the numbers would change. $15 was all she possessed. She could buy 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and divide them between Chloe and Palmer. Perhaps she could afford a small milk for each of them. That might leave $1 or 2 for the tip. She would not eat. She had not eaten for 2 days. The hunger pains in her stomach had faded hours before. Now it was just a constant, dull ache she had trained herself to ignore. The waitress came to their table. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair in a bun, and a look that suggested nothing could surprise her anymore. She took a notepad from her apron and clicked her pen. "What will it be, hun?" Juliana's throat felt tight. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. The waitress stood patiently. Chloe glanced up at her mother. Palmer's little hand reached across and rested on Juliana's arm. "Mama." Juliana made herself talk. Her voice was weak and unsteady. "2 grilled cheese sandwiches, please, and 2 small milks." The waitress wrote the order without making eye contact. "Anything for yourself?" "No, only for them." The waitress stopped. Her gaze moved to Juliana's face, which was pale, tired, and had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She then looked at the twins, whose small bodies were huddled against their mother like scared little animals. For a second, the woman's expression softened, but she remained silent. She simply gave a nod and walked away. Juliana let out a slow breath, her fingers still clenched around the menu's edge. She set it down gently, as if it were fragile. Chloe moved in closer. "Mama, are we going home after this?" A knot formed in Juliana's chest. Home? They had no home. For the last 3 weeks, they had been living in a decaying motel at the edge of town. The kind of place where the floor smelled of dampness and the heater made a rattling sound all through the night. She had paid for 2 more nights with the last bit of money she earned cleaning houses under the table. She had no idea what they would do after that. "We will find a way, sweetheart," Juliana whispered, moving a piece of hair from Chloe's forehead. "We always do." But as she spoke the words, her gaze drifted toward the entrance. It was not with hope, but with fear. The men who had stolen everything from her, who had stood in her home and emptied it while her daughters sobbed, were still out there, and they had been perfectly clear. They would continue to come for her until she settled her husband's debt. But she had nothing left. Her husband, David, had passed away 6 months earlier, a heart attack at 34 years old. It was swift, cruel, and absolute. 2 weeks later, she discovered he had borrowed money, a large sum, from men who operated outside of banks and legal systems, men who had no sympathy for widows, children, or sad stories. She attempted to negotiate with them, pleading to pay them back in smaller amounts. She told them she would find work, sell what was left, and do anything necessary. They said no. A debt does not disappear when a man dies. One of them stated, his voice devoid of emotion, and we are not in the business of forgiveness. They seized the house, the furniture, David's tools, and even his clothing. When Juliana asked what would happen if she could not pay, the man leaned toward her and smiled. Then we will take something else. She knew exactly what he was implying. So she fled. She took the twins and any cash she could conceal and vanished into the cold. But she knew they had not stopped looking. She felt it like a constant watch on her, like shadows that shifted when her back was turned. She could never stay in one place for too long. She could not form friendships. She could not rely on anyone. Her only goal was to make it through one more day. The diner's door swung open once more. Juliana's head shot up, her muscles tensing. But it was only an older couple wearing heavy coats and scarves, smiling as they brushed snow off their clothing. She let out a shaky breath and looked at her hands. They were shaking. Chloe saw. She slid her little hand into Juliana's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "It is all right, Mama," she murmured. A burning sensation filled Juliana's throat. She squeezed back, unable to form words. The food came a few minutes later. 2 perfectly toasted grilled cheese sandwiches sliced into triangles. 2 small glasses of milk with straws placed inside. The twins' faces brightened. Juliana's heart felt like it was breaking. "Go on, my babies," she whispered. "Eat." Chloe and Palmer did not hesitate. They grabbed the sandwiches with both hands and took large bites, melted cheese stretching from their mouths. Juliana just watched them, her eyes becoming watery. This was everything she had. This moment, this table, and these 2 little girls who still thought she could protect them. And then the door opened. A wave of freezing air rushed into the diner, and time seemed to freeze. The man who entered was tall with broad shoulders, wearing a black suit that likely cost more than Juliana's earnings for an entire year. His long, dark hair was combed back from a face of sharp angles and icy composure. Tattoos crept up from his collar. The dark ink was a clear sign of violence and authority. 4 other men followed him inside, moving silently and watchfully, all of them dressed in black. The diner became completely quiet. No one said a word. No one dared to move. Juliana's breathing stopped. She recognized that kind of silence. She had experienced it in her own living room. It was the silence that happened when the men came to take her belongings. And now, on Christmas Eve, with nowhere else to escape, one of them was here. Adriano Silva did not need to introduce himself. His mere presence was enough. He stood near the entrance, snowflakes melting on his black suit, while his dark eyes surveyed the room with the calm focus of a predator claiming his ground. His 4 men spread out behind him. They were not hostile or menacing, just present. They were silent guards who knew their boss did not require protection, only people to witness. The diner was utterly still. An old man's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. A young couple's conversation died. A coffee cup hung in the air. Even the waitress, who had been pouring water, stood frozen with the pitcher in her hand. Nobody looked straight at Adriano, but every single person was aware of him. Juliana felt her chest tighten. Her hand instinctively shot out to cover Chloe's, pressing her daughter's small fingers down. Palmer paused with food in her mouth, her eyes wide with confusion. "Mama," Palmer whispered. "Shh." Juliana's reply was so quiet it was barely a sound. "Do not move." She understood this quiet. She had survived it once before, the moment when dangerous men walk into a space and steal all the oxygen, the moment when normal people fade into the background, becoming nothing more than scenery with a pulse. Her stomach churned. Please do not let them be here for me. Please, not now, not with my girls here. Adriano's gaze swept systematically around the diner. He observed the old couple in the booth, the young family by the window, and the single trucker at the counter with his black coffee. His eyes lingered on each person for the same measured moment, analyzing, judging, and then moving on. And then his focus settled on Juliana. She felt it like a physical touch. Her breathing completely ceased. For 3 whole seconds, Adriano Silva studied the woman in the faded olive jacket, her blonde hair hanging limply around a face etched with weariness and terror. He noticed the 2 small girls huddled at her sides like tiny birds seeking refuge beneath a damaged wing. He noticed the partially eaten grilled cheese sandwiches and the 2 small glasses of milk. His gaze fell on the empty tabletop in front of her, the space where food should have been. Something in his expression changed, becoming cold and precise. Then he broke eye contact. Juliana felt a wave of dizziness from the relief. She gripped the table's edge to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. Adriano walked further into the diner, his men keeping a careful distance behind him. He picked a booth toward the rear, not hidden in the corner, but positioned to see and hear everything. One of his men slid into the seat opposite him. The other 3 stayed on their feet, standing at key points around the small restaurant. They were not blocking doors or looming over anyone. They were simply there. The diner's occupants started to breathe again. Conversations picked up in quiet murmurs. The sound of forks touching plates returned. The waitress began to move, though her hands trembled as she walked to Adriano's table. "Coffee," Adriano said, cutting her off before she could ask. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it filled the space. "Black, and an order of whatever she is eating." He motioned with his head toward the waitress. The young woman stared back, her face a mask of confusion. I am sorry? You have not had a break all night." The statement was not a question. "Get something for yourself, I am covering it." The waitress just looked at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. Adriano's face remained a stone mask. That was not a request. "I thank you," she finally managed to say, and then she rushed away from the table. Juliana made herself look back at her daughters. Chloe was eating again, but her motions were robotic and anxious. Palmer had stopped eating entirely, her sandwich forgotten as she stared at the men in black suits. "Palmer," Juliana whispered, turning her daughter's head to face her. "Eat, sweetie. It is all right." But it was not all right, because Adriano Silva was watching them again from his booth. He was not obvious about it, but Juliana could feel his stare. She had learned a lot in the last 6 months, developing survival skills that screamed whenever danger was close. Right now, every single nerve she had was on alert. She watched from the corner of her vision as Adriano raised his coffee cup. It was black, with no sugar, just as he had requested. He took a long, slow drink. His eyes were constantly scanning the room. He saw the young couple pay their check and leave in a hurry. He saw the truck driver watch him in the reflection from the counter. He saw the old man lean over to his wife and saw her grip his hand tighter. Fear had a scent, and Adriano Silva had learned to recognize it a long time ago. But something different held his focus. The woman in the green jacket. She had barely shifted since his arrival. Her posture was protective, her body curved around her 2 children. Her shoulders were hunched, as if she was trying to become invisible. And her eyes, those tired, terrified eyes, kept glancing at the door. Not at him, but at the entrance, as if she was waiting for someone. Adriano placed his coffee cup down with deliberate care. He recognized that expression. He had seen it countless times. It was the look of a person being hunted. It was the look of someone who understood that safety was a lie, that at any second the door could swing open and their deepest fear could enter the room. He shifted back in his seat, tapping his fingers once on the table in a quiet command. One of his men, a powerfully built enforcer named Rico, moved toward him. Boss? Adriano did not turn to look at him. His gaze stayed locked on Juliana's table. The woman? In the corner? Do you see her? Rico looked over. Yeah, she looks scared. Everyone gets scared when you come in, boss. No. Adriano's voice became even quieter. She was scared long before I walked in here. Rico was silent, waiting for his orders. Adriano watched as Juliana slid a hand into her jacket pocket, her fingers wrapping around something inside, checking on it, making sure it was there. The motion was automatic, a nervous habit. He had seen that habit before, too. People who constantly checked their money did it for one of two reasons. They were either completely broke, or they were trapped in a deep debt. Sometimes it was both. She bought food for her kids, Adriano murmured, but nothing for herself. Maybe she is not hungry. She is starving. A muscle in Adriano's jaw twitched. Look at her hands. Look at her face. She has not had a real meal in days. Rico adjusted his stance. You want me to do something? No, Adriano stopped him. Not right now. But his eyes never left her, because Adriano Silva did not build an empire by ignoring what his gut told him. And at that moment, his gut was screaming that the frightened woman in the corner was more than just poor, she was on the run. And the people she was running from were the kind of people Adriano understood completely. She had not looked at him since the awful second their eyes first connected, but she felt his stare. The force of his attention was like a physical weight pressing down on her. Her hand shook as she reached out to steady Palmer's glass of milk, saving it just before her daughter sent it tumbling. Be careful, sweetheart, she murmured. Chloe was done with her food. She was sitting perfectly still, her little hands in her lap as her eyelids grew heavy with sleep. Palmer kept eating, but her movements were sluggish, her chewing slow and automatic. They both needed to rest. They needed a safe, warm place to sleep, all the things Juliana was failing to provide. She eyed the bill the waitress had placed face down on the table. A knot formed in her stomach. She refused to look at it. She could not bear to see the number that would confirm if her math was right, or if she would face the ultimate humiliation. Having to return food, asking for one meal to be split between two children, pleading for kindness from total strangers. Her hand trembled as she moved toward the check. Stop. The voice was right next to her ear. Juliana's head shot up, her heart leaping into her throat. Adriano Silva was standing beside their booth. His hands were tucked in his pockets and his face was a mask. Seeing him this close, he seemed even larger, taller and more solid, his very being consuming the air around them. The ink on his neck formed complex patterns, designs that were not random. They were the kind that carried meaning, a history told through pain and violence. Juliana's throat felt like sand. The words would not come. I am so sorry. Do not touch that bill, Adriano commanded in a low voice. He did not have to raise it to be heard. Juliana snatched her hand back as if the paper had scorched her skin. I did not mean to. I was not. She was rambling, unable to form a clear thought. Chloe and Palmer huddled against their mother, their small faces looking up at the towering man in the dark suit. Chloe's lower lip began to quiver. Palmer's eyes were huge with fear and fear. Adriano's attention moved to the twins, and an unreadable emotion crossed his face for a split second. Then he looked back at Juliana. Where is your husband? The question felt like a physical blow. Juliana opened her mouth, then shut it, then opened it again. He is. The words would not come out. Adriano was patient. He did not ask again or try to hurry her. He just stood there, his dark gaze steady and unwavering. Juliana felt the sting of tears and fought them back, trying to keep herself composed, but the words finally escaped, broken and raw. He is gone. There was a pause. He died, she whispered, 6 months ago. The diner seemed to dissolve around them. The other conversations, the sound of silverware, the quiet Christmas song on the radio, all of it faded into unimportant noise. Adriano's expression did not shift, but the muscle in his jaw tightened just slightly. "How old are they?" he asked, nodding toward the twins. "5?" Juliana's voice was shaky. "They just had their 5th birthday." Adriano looked at Chloe and Palmer again. He truly saw them this time. Two little girls with blonde hair and terrified expressions, wearing jackets too thin for the cold, sitting in a diner on Christmas Eve with a mother who could not even afford her own meal. Inside his pockets, his hands clenched into fists. "How did he die?" Adriano asked, his voice lower now. "A heart attack?" Juliana dabbed at her eyes with the back of her hand. "The doctors told me it was fast, that there was no pain. But you suffered. It was a statement of fact." Juliana's breath caught in her throat. She could only nod, not trusting her voice. Adriano took the chair from the opposite side of her table and sat down. He did not ask for permission. His men kept their distance, watching but staying back. Up close, Juliana could see more details. The shadows had concealed the thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the silver band on his right hand, and the way his dark eyes seemed to look right through her. Adriano spoke, his voice calm. "Tell me what happened after he passed." It was a command, not a question. Juliana's fingers knotted in her lap. "I cannot. I should not speak of it." "Tell me." A current of absolute authority ran beneath his words, something that had nothing to do with loudness and everything to do with control, and her defenses crumbled. The story spilled out of her. "My husband, David, he took out a loan." Her voice was a faint whisper. "It was for a business, for a delivery truck. He wanted to build his own company. He promised it would fix everything for us, give our girls a better future." She stopped, her breathing ragged. "He did not borrow from a bank. He borrowed from certain men." "I understand the type," Adriano stated plainly. Juliana gave a slight nod, hot tears tracing paths down her cheeks. "And they came for me after he was gone. 2 weeks later. I knew nothing about the money. David had never said a word, and his death meant nothing to them. Chloe and Palmer meant nothing to them. They were only interested in what they were owed." Her voice climbed, shaking with panic. "I pleaded with them. I swore I would repay it. I would find work. 2 jobs, 3, anything it took. I asked for a payment plan. Just a little time, please." And what was their response? Juliana's expression collapsed. "They told me that a debt does not vanish when a man dies." Her voice fell to a fractured whisper. "They told me they do not offer compassion." A muscle tightened in Adriano's jaw. "They stripped us of everything." Juliana went on, the words flowing like a hemorrhage. "Our house, our furniture, David's tools, his clothing, things that were his, that were ours, our families, they took it all. And when I asked what would happen if I could not pay the remainder, one of them?" She halted, her body trembling violently. "One of them did what?" Adriano's voice was dangerously low as he smiled. Juliana met Adriano's gaze with terrified eyes. He smiled and said, "We will collect something else." And then he looked at my daughters. The air in the diner felt like it had dropped by 10 degrees. Adriano was perfectly still, silent. But a shift occurred in his eyes. A change into something frigid, deadly, and utterly without mercy. "Their names," he said, his voice soft. "What?" "I need their names." Juliana's eyes grew wide. "I am unable to. If they discover I talked, they will not." Adriano leaned in just a fraction. "Names." And before Juliana could think, before the need to survive could scream for her silence, she breathed 2 names into the air between them. They were names that were meaningless to her, but held immense significance for Adriano Silva. He knew these names. They belonged to men in his world. Men who had broken the code. Men who had just sealed their own fate. Grior and Tommy, Juliana whispered, her voice barely a sound. Grior, I do not know his family name, but Tommy. Tommy Rudo. The instant she spoke the names, she wished she could take them back. Adriano's face remained a mask. No emotion, no movement. Yet the space around him felt different, charged with a dark and heavy pressure. One of his associates, a man named Rico, adjusted his stance in a nearly invisible motion. Another man made eye contact with the one next to him. A silent language passed between them that Juliana could not interpret, but she felt its meaning in her bones. They recognized those names. They visited 3 times. Juliana said, the story now unstoppable. The first visit was 2 weeks after the burial. They were almost civil. They explained that David owed them $43,000. They demanded the full amount right away. Her hands clenched so hard her knuckles went pale. I did not have it. I had $300 in our bank account. David's life insurance was delayed for months while they conducted an investigation. I presented the bank records, the unpaid bills. I presented everything. I begged them for patience. And what happened next? Adriano's voice was completely steady, perfectly even. But Juliana detected an undertone that made her throat feel tight. They said they would return in 1 week. When they came back, they had a truck. Her voice broke. They carried out our sofa, our kitchen table, the television, David's tools from the garage. He loved those tools so much. They dismantled the girls' bunk beds as Chloe and Palmer stood there and watched. A single tear escaped and rolled down her face. The third visit, they came with documents, legal documents. They informed me the house was used as collateral, that David had signed the deed over. I had no idea. He never mentioned that he had risked our home. Adriano's fingers tapped the table once. A slow, deliberate sound. How much is the outstanding amount? Juliana's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. Everything. They seized the house, but they claimed its value was not enough. They claimed David had borrowed more than they recovered. They said I still owed them $28,000 for a truck that was taken back 1 week after David passed away. Juliana's voice swelled with the sheer unfairness of it all. They took the truck. They took the house. They took every single thing we had, and they still claim I owe them money. Adriano leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on her face. When was their last visit? 4 days ago. Juliana's voice fell to a terrified whisper. They located the motel where we were hiding. I do not know how they did it. I had been so cautious. But Tommy appeared at our door at 2 in the morning. He did not make any threats. He did not need to. He just stood there and said, "We have found you now. We will always find you." Her entire frame shook. I had our things packed in 10 minutes. We fled that same night. We have been on the move every day. We sleep in the car. We find shelters when we are lucky. I cannot allow them to find us ever again. Chloe let out a tiny, stifled sob. Palmer pressed her face into her mother's side. Adriano's attention moved to the 2 girls, and for a brief second, a flicker of humanity showed in his eyes. Then it vanished. These men, Adriano asked with precision, Grior and Tommy, did they mention their employer? Juliana shook her head. No, they only stated they were collecting a debt, that they were entitled to it. They are not. The words were so soft, Juliana barely heard them. What did you say? Adriano's eyes locked with hers. They have no right. Not to your house, not to your husband's possessions, and certainly not to frighten a widow and her children. Juliana just stared at him, torn between confusion and a spark of hope. I do not understand. How can you be sure? Because people like that follow certain rules. Adriano's voice was now cold and exact. And they have violated every last one. He reached inside his coat. Juliana flinched without thinking. He pulled out a wallet made of leather. He opened it and took out a few bills without looking at them, then set them on the table. $300. Juliana's eyes widened. I am unable. I cannot accept this. It is not a gift for you. Adriano slid the cash toward her. It is for them, he said, nodding toward Chloe and Palmer. Use it to buy them proper coats, new clothes, and a secure room to sleep in tonight. But I cannot. Adriano reached for the check the server had delivered. He saw the total was $14.76 and took out a $50 bill. He put the check and the new bill on the table's edge for the server to find. Then he reached over and gently slid Juliana's own crumpled $15 bill back to her. You keep it, he said, his voice direct. Juliana's hands covered her mouth. A sob tore through her, a sound full of 6 months of fear and weariness. Why? She managed to ask. Why are you doing this for us? We are strangers to you. Adriano rose from his seat, fastening his suit jacket with careful motions. Because I know how it feels to see your own mother starve so that you have food to eat, he said softly. And I know what kind of men Grior and Tommy are. I know precisely what they represent. He looked down at her, and Juliana saw a look in his eyes that made her hold her breath. It was not pity, it was recognition. They will not bother you again, Adriano stated. Juliana's voice was unsteady. How? How can you be certain? Adriano leaned closer, his voice so quiet that only she could hear him. Because men of their kind only exist for as long as I permit it. A chill went through Juliana's veins, not of fear, but of sudden clarity. She finally knew what he was, who he was, and why those names had mattered so much to him. Do not say a word, Adriano said, as he stood up straight. Just take your daughters to a safe place for the night. Make sure they are warm. Give them another meal. And tomorrow, he stopped for a moment. Tomorrow, I will handle this so you will never have to be afraid again. Before Juliana could form a reply, Adriano turned and moved toward the exit. His men assembled behind him, silent figures moving with perfect. But as he was about to leave, Adriano paused at the door. He tilted his head, not turning around, just listening. One last thing, his voice carried across the room. Juliana's reply was barely audible. Yes. Where do you plan to stay tonight? I'm not sure. I thought I would try the riverside, about 3 blocks north. Adriano's voice was firm, leaving no space for debate. Room 212. It is already paid, for 1 week, with no questions asked. I cannot. You can. Adriano's tone softened just a fraction. And for their sake, you will. With that, he opened the door and disappeared into the falling snow. A heavy silence settled over the diner after he was gone. Gradually, the low murmur of conversation started again. The clatter of plates resumed. The holiday music continued to play. But Juliana sat motionless in the booth. She stared at the $300 on the table and the $15 he had given back to her earlier. Through the frost-covered window, she saw Adriano standing next to a black sedan, his voice low as he spoke into a phone. His face was impassive, yet his eyes held a promise of retribution. Juliana was frozen in place. She stayed in the booth, her gaze locked on the money as if it might disappear if she looked away. $300. It was more cash than she had held at one time since David passed away. It was enough to keep her daughters fed for many weeks. It was more than enough. Mama? Chloe's little voice broke through her thoughts. Juliana glanced down and saw both twins gazing up at her, their eyes wide with confusion. Palmer's little hand was still clutching her arm. Chloe's lower lip began to quiver. Is that frightening man gone? Palmer whispered. Juliana tried to say yes, but the word wouldn't come out. Was he frightening? Of course. He was absolutely terrifying, but he had also provided them with more help than anyone had in the last 6 months. He is gone, sweetheart, Juliana finally whispered. He is not going to harm us. Are you certain? Chloe asked, her voice so tiny it nearly broke Juliana's heart. Juliana hugged both girls tightly, kissing the crowns of their heads. I am certain. But as she spoke the words, her gaze drifted back to the window. Adriano was still out there, beside a polished black car, with a phone held to his ear. Even at this distance, through the iced-over glass, she could see the tension in his shoulders and the cold anger in his stance. He was making phone calls, and a deep instinct told Juliana that they were about Gregor and Tommy. A shiver went through her, but it was not from fear. It was something else entirely, something she could not identify. Hope? That was too risky a feeling. But perhaps it was the beginning of possibility. The waitress came to their table with caution, her eyes moving from Juliana to the pile of money. She collected the $50 bill and the check, then hesitated. "He is a generous man," she said, her tone careful, as if she were trying out the phrase. Juliana had no idea what to say. The waitress glanced at the twins, then met Juliana's eyes again. Her expression warmed. "You know something? Those grilled cheese sandwiches seemed a bit on the small side. What if I bring you all some fries? And maybe some hot chocolate for the girls?" "I can't pay for that," Juliana began. "It is on the house." The waitress's voice was resolute. "It is Christmas Eve. Nobody should be hungry on Christmas Eve." Before Juliana could object again, the woman had turned and walked toward the kitchen. Chloe and Palmer looked at each other, and for the first time that evening, their eyes shone with excitement. "Hot chocolate?" Palmer said the words as if they were magic. "And French fries?" Chloe added. Juliana felt the sting of fresh tears. She blinked hard to hold them back. "Yes, my babies, hot chocolate and French fries." The twins offered genuine smiles, not the scared, hesitant ones they had shown for months. And inside her chest, Juliana felt something break free. How long had it been since she saw them smile that way? 10 minutes later, their table was full of food. A large basket of golden fries, 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate with whipped cream and chocolate shavings on top. And, because the waitress seemed unable to stop herself, 3 pieces of apple pie, still warm from the oven. "This is for everyone," the waitress said with emphasis, placing a fork down for Juliana. "And I expect to see that fork being used when I return." Juliana looked at the pie as her stomach churned with a mix of hunger and guilt. "Mama, you need to eat," Chloe insisted. "The lady said you have to." "Yes, Mama," Palmer repeated, already dipping a French fry in ketchup. "You must." Juliana looked at her daughters. Their faces were now rosy from the warmth of the diner. Their eyes were bright, and their small hands were grabbing for food without hesitation or fear. She picked up her fork. The first taste of apple pie was almost painful. Her stomach, unaccustomed to a real meal, protested with a sharp cramp. But she made herself swallow it, then took a second bite, and then a third. Chloe and Palmer watched her eat with clear relief on their little faces. "You are not going to fade away, Mama," Chloe said quietly. Juliana's fork stopped in midair. "What did you say?" "You were getting lighter," Palmer explained. Her voice was simple and direct, like the wind could take you. Juliana's throat tightened until she could not breathe. Dear God, they had seen it. Of course they had. "I am not going anywhere," she promised with a fierce whisper. "I am right here." The twins seemed satisfied and went back to their food and drinks. But Juliana could not hold back the tears that streamed down her face as she continued to eat. On the other side of the diner, a few customers observed the family. An older woman leaned over to her husband. "That is the table he stopped at," she murmured. "The man in the dark suit." Her husband gave a slow nod. "I noticed. Why would he help them?" The old man was silent for a few seconds. He then replied, "Because men of his kind remember the feeling of being hungry, and it is something they never forget." His wife looked again at Juliana and the twins, then at the cash still on the table. "I really hope she accepts it," she said softly. "I hope her pride doesn't stop her." "It will not," her husband replied with confidence. "She has children. Pride cannot feed children." Outside, Adriano finished his phone call. He stood in the falling snow and stared into the distance. Rico approached him carefully. Boss? Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo, Adriano stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. They have been making collections without my approval, running a private operation, and taking a share that is not theirs. Rico's jaw clenched. For how long? For at least a year, possibly more. Adriano's hands tightened into fists. They have been going after widows and single mothers, people who cannot defend themselves, people who are unaware of how things work. My God. They are using my name, Adriano went on, his voice becoming dangerously quiet, telling their victims they represent me, that I have sanctioned the debts. Rico's face grew grim. They are finished. Not yet, Adriano said, turning to look directly at him. First, I need to know every person involved. Who has been ignoring this? Who has been accepting their payments? And after that, Adriano's smile was chilling and cruel. After that, we will issue a reminder to everyone about why the rules are in place. Rico gave a single, sharp nod. What should be done about the woman, Juliana? Adriano glanced back toward the diner window. He saw Juliana eating at a slow pace while her daughters laughed over their hot chocolate. For the first time since he had entered, her shoulders were not tense with fear. She will be protected, Adriano said softly. 24 hours a day. I do not care if she is aware of it. Nobody is to approach her. Nobody is to go near those kids. For how much time? For however long is necessary. Adriano's tone was absolute. Until Gregor and Tommy have been dealt with, and until every single collector in this city understands what happens when you disobey the rules. Rico paused. Boss, she has children. What if this gets messy? It will not. Adriano's gaze was hard and unwavering. Because Gregor and Tommy are not going to survive long enough to seek revenge. He took out his phone and dialed another number. The call was answered immediately. It is me, Adriano said. I require all information on Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. Every debt they have collected, every widow they have threatened, every dollar they have taken. He waited for a moment. And I want it all by morning. He disconnected the call and stood in the snow, watching as Juliana neatly folded the $300 and placed it inside her coat pocket. Her head lifted suddenly, and her eyes met his through the glass. For a brief second, they simply looked at one another. Then, Juliana formed two words with her lips. Thank you. Adriano gave one nod in return. Then he turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving only his footprints behind in the snow. Juliana pulled her daughters near as they walked out of the diner. The warmth from their meal was still a pleasant glow in their small bodies. The snowfall had increased, becoming heavier and blanketing the sidewalks in white. The Christmas lights were blurred by the flakes, resembling soft watercolor paintings. Chloe gripped her mother's hand tightly. Palmer held the paper bag that the waitress had given to Juliana. It contained the leftover pie, wrapped up carefully. For breakfast tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word itself felt unfamiliar, almost strange. For the past 6 months, Juliana had lived only in terms of hours. The next hour, the next meal, the next safe place. But now, with $300 in her pocket and a hotel room waiting just 3 blocks to the north, tomorrow felt like a real possibility. She pulled her coat tighter around her and began to walk. The street was peaceful. Most people were in their homes now, gathered by Christmas trees, opening presents, and singing carols. Juliana forced herself not to think about how that felt. She tried to block the memory of last Christmas. David was alive, the house was warm, and gifts were piled under the tree. Do not do this, she told herself. Just keep moving. They had walked for 2 blocks when Juliana first sensed it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Her pace faltered. Her hand holding Chloe's tightened without her realizing it. She looked quickly over her shoulder. The street was empty. Nothing but vacant sidewalks and the quiet fall of snow. Yet the sensation would not leave her. She walked more quickly now, her eyes checking every dark shape, every vehicle on the street, every unlit doorway. "Mama," Chloe's voice was tiny. "Is something wrong?" "It is nothing, sweetie. We are almost there." But her heart was pounding in her chest. They made a turn onto Riverside Avenue, and Juliana saw the inn, a simple two-story building with a bright neon sign that glowed with the word vacancy in red. A wave of relief washed over her. So close, just a little farther. And then she heard the sound of a car door opening just behind them. Juliana went rigid. Her blood felt like ice as she heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow. They were heavy, they were steady, and they were getting nearer. "No, please, no. Not here. Not when we are this close." She whirled around, shoving Chloe and Palmer behind her, preparing to flee, to cry for help, to fight if she had to. A man came into the light of a nearby streetlight. He was huge, with dark skin and a long black coat. He was built like a man who could end a fight before it started. Juliana knew him on sight. He was one of Adriano's people. "Mrs. Molina." His voice was steady, controlled. "My name is Rico. I work for Mr. Silva." Juliana's breath came in ragged bursts. "What do you want?" Rico raised his open hands, showing he was not a threat. "Mr. Silva sent me to see you to the inn safely." She was stunned. "He did what?" "You are being watched," Rico said simply. "Not by us. By them." A cold knot formed in Juliana's stomach. "Gregor and Tommy," Rico's face hardened. "Not them directly, but they have men out there. Eyes on every street. Mr. Silva is making certain they cannot get to you or your daughters." Juliana looked past him to a dark sedan idling by the curb. Its windows were tinted. Its engine was a quiet rumble. "How long have you been following us?" she whispered. Since the moment you left the diner, Rico's answer was direct, not apologetic. "And we will not stop until this is finished." Juliana felt a wave of both relief and terror. "Where is he?" She could not bring herself to ask the full question. She did not know how to ask what Adriano was planning. Rico seemed to understand her unspoken fear. "Mr. Silva deals with his own matters personally. That is everything you need to know." He motioned toward the inn. "Go on inside. Your room is 212. It has all been taken care of. In the morning, someone will be posted outside your door. You will not see them, but they will be present. For how much time? For as long as it requires." Juliana just stared, her mind racing to comprehend the situation. "Why would he do this? We mean nothing to him." "You made him remember something," Rico said softly, cutting her off. "Something he works very hard to push away." Before Juliana could ask anything more, Rico gave a single nod and returned to the car. The sedan drove off without a sound, vanishing into the snowy darkness. Juliana remained on the sidewalk, her daughters clinging to her as she watched the red taillights disappear. "Mama," Palmer said, pulling at her coat, "can we please go in? It is cold out here." Juliana looked down at her girls, at their exhausted faces and their expectant eyes, and she made up her mind. "Yes, my love," she whispered. "Let us go inside." Room 212 was modest but spotless. It had 2 double beds with heavy quilts, a bathroom that had hot water, a heater that worked properly, and a television on the wall. For Juliana, it felt like a royal suite. Chloe and Palmer immediately ran to the beds and began to jump on them, their laughter echoing bright and pure. "Mama, you have to feel how soft these are." Juliana lingered in the doorway, a lump forming in her throat. How long had it been since they had slept on proper beds? Weeks? A month or more? She shut the door and secured all the locks. The deadbolt, the chain, every single one. Then she moved to the window and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The street was calm and empty, but she understood that they were there. Adriano's men were watching, keeping them safe. And somewhere else in that city, Adriano himself was on the phone, arranging things on a board that Juliana could not envision, taking actions she likely did not want to understand. He was doing it for her, and for Chloe and Palmer. She let the curtain drop. An hour passed, and the girls were sound asleep in one bed, their small forms finally at ease, finally secure. Juliana sat on the other bed, her gaze fixed on the $300 lying on the table. It was real money, which meant real security and real hope. But it was from a man who operated in a world of violence and dread, a man whose phone call could make people vanish. Juliana knew she should be horrified. She knew she should grab her daughters and flee as far as possible, but she could not, because for the first time in 6 months, Chloe and Palmer were sleeping without being afraid. For the first time in 6 months, Juliana was not straining to hear footsteps outside. For the first time in 6 months, they were secure. That security was bought with a cost Adriano Silva was likely paying in blood. Juliana shut her eyes, whispering into the stillness of the room. I am so sorry. Sorry for what was about to unfold. Sorry for the violence she knew was on its way. Sorry that her own desperation had brought a man like Adriano Silva into their world. But she was not sorry enough to leave. Her daughters were sleeping, and that meant more to her than her own conscience. On the other side of the city, in a warehouse that smelled of grease and damp concrete, Adriano Silva stood over two men bound to chairs, Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. Finding them had been simple, far too simple. They were careless men who believed they were beyond reach. Adriano paced slowly around them, his steps echoing in the vast space. $43,000, he said softly. That is the amount you claimed Juliana Molina's late husband owed you. Gregor's eye was already swelling closed. Tommy had a broken nose. Neither man said a word. This is the interesting part, Adriano went on, his tone almost casual. I looked into it. David Molina took out a loan for $8,000. The truck you took back was valued at $12,000. The house you seized was worth $90,000. He came to a stop right in front of them. So, according to my calculations, you were not just settling a debt. You were stealing from a widow and her children. Then you had the nerve to claim she owed you more. Tommy spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. You were operating without my permission, Adriano said, finishing the thought. You were using my name to terrorize women and children. He bent down, bringing his face close to Tommy's. You violated the rules, Adriano whispered. And the rules are there for a reason. Gregor finally found his voice. Silva, please. We were not aware she had your protection. Adriano stood up straight. She has it now. And so does every other widow you have extorted. He took out his phone and made a call. Bring the files to me, he ordered. A few seconds later, Rico came in holding a large folder. Adriano opened it. Inside were pages filled with names, addresses, and the amounts they had taken. They were all widows, all single mothers. All of them had been victims of Gregor and Tommy's greed. You will return every last dollar, Adriano declared, plus interest. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. And after that, we will discuss the consequences. The warehouse grew quiet, the only sound being the snow hitting the metal roof. Miles away, in a warm hotel room, Juliana Molina slept without interruption for the first time in half a year. The morning sun streamed through the hotel window in soft golden rays. Juliana awoke slowly, momentarily disoriented. Then she felt the soft mattress beneath her, a real bed, clean linens, warmth. She remembered the diner. Adriano Silva, the $300, room 212. She rose from the bed, careful not to disturb the twins. Chloe and Palmer were still asleep in the other bed, nestled together. Their faces were calm. Their breathing was steady and deep. They had not woken up a single time during the night. There were no nightmares, no crying, and no shivering in their sleep. A wave of emotion tightened Juliana's chest. She got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside. The street was peaceful. A few cars drove by. A man was walking his dog. It all appeared so normal, but Juliana knew the truth now. Somewhere out there, Adriano's men were still on watch, keeping them safe. She let the curtain fall and went into the bathroom. A hot shower. She could not remember the last time she had taken one. 20 minutes later, she felt like a new person. Her hair was clean, her skin was warm, and her muscles were finally relaxed. She found some clean clothes in her bag. They were wrinkled, but they would do. The twins began to wake up, stretching their small bodies and blinking their eyes open. Mama. Chloe's voice was filled with sleep. I am right here, my dear. Palmer sat up and looked around, confused. Where are we? We are somewhere safe, Juliana told her, sitting down on their bed. Somewhere warm. She helped them get washed and dressed with practiced motherly motions. But her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. What took place last night? What did Adriano do? She forced the questions from her mind. She did not want the answers. She could not handle the answers. A knock at the door made her entire body go rigid. Chloe and Palmer fell silent, their small forms instantly tense. Juliana's heart pounded in her chest as she walked to the door. She looked through the small peephole. It was Rico. He was standing in the hall with a paper bag and a cardboard tray of drinks. Juliana let out a shaky breath and opened the door, but left the security chain in place. Mrs. Molina. Rico's tone was polite. Mr. Silva sent breakfast for you. He held up the bag. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries wafted through the small opening. Juliana's stomach rumbled in response. She was at a loss for words. Thank you. Rico placed the food and drinks on the floor outside her door. He also sent this. He put a large manila envelope on top of the bag. Juliana stared at it. What is in there? It is information, Rico stated plainly. And directions. Mr. Silva will clarify everything when he gets here. Juliana's eyes grew wide. He is coming to this room in about an hour. Rico's face was impossible to read. He wishes to speak with you. Before Juliana could say anything, Rico turned and walked away down the hall. Juliana waited for him to disappear from view before she quickly brought in the bag, the drinks, and the envelope. She shut the door and locked it securely again. Chloe and Palmer were watching her with curious eyes. Who was that man? Palmer asked. He is a friend, Juliana replied, unsure of what else to say. He brought us something to eat. The twins' faces brightened. Inside the bag, they found fresh croissants, cups of fruit, yogurt, and orange juice. Real food, good food. They sat down and ate together. On one of the beds, while a television played cartoons at a low volume, Chloe and Palmer were talking with excitement about the show, the comfortable beds, and how warm the room felt. It was a normal, happy conversation between children. Juliana felt tears forming again, but she quickly blinked them away. Once they were done with their food, she picked up the large brown envelope with unsteady hands. Inside, she found a stack of legal papers. The first page made her gasp. It was a notice of debt cancellation. This document certifies that all debts belonging to David Molina, deceased, are hereby considered null and void. No additional collection efforts will be pursued against Juliana Molina or her children. It was signed by Adriano Silva, on behalf of Silva Enterprises. Juliana's hands shook as she looked through the rest of the documents. There were bank records showing the initial loan of $8,000. There were receipts for the repossessed truck, valued at $12,000, and paperwork detailing the seizure of their house, was valued at $90,000. A final sheet of paper showed a clear calculation. Gregor and Tommy had not just collected the full amount of the supposed debt, they had pocketed a profit of almost $60,000. A message was written in perfect script at the very bottom. You were never in debt. They stole from you. That has been fixed. Juliana covered her mouth with her hand, silencing a sob. An hour passed before another knock came. Juliana knew it was coming, yet her hands still trembled when she opened the door. Adriano Silva was in the hall, wearing a different, perfectly fitted suit of charcoal gray. He appeared just as he had before, powerful, in control, and dangerous. But something in his eyes looked different, almost softer. He looked tired. Mrs. Molina, he said softly, may I step inside? Juliana looked over her shoulder at the twins watching television. Then she nodded and moved out of the way. When Adriano came in, the small room seemed to shrink around him. He looked over at Chloe and Palmer, and a brief expression crossed his face, something that was almost tender. "Girls," he said, his voice now gentle. "Can you please watch your programs for a few minutes? Your mother and I need to speak." The girls looked to Juliana for permission, and she gave a small nod. Adriano did not speak again until they were focused on the screen. Then he gave Juliana his full attention. "You have seen the papers." It was a statement, not a question. Juliana could only nod, her voice gone. "Then you understand that you are free," Adriano stated. "The debt is gone. Gregor and Tommy will never trouble you or your family again." "What did you do to them?" The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. Adriano's face remained neutral. "I fixed a problem. Did you have them killed?" "No." His tone was empty of emotion. "But they were made to understand what happens when they make choices like these. They will be repaying every single widow they robbed, plus interest. And if they ever think of crossing that line again—" He let the words hang in the air. He did not need to finish. Juliana swallowed against a dry throat. "Why are you helping me? You have no reason to do this for us." Adriano remained silent for a long moment before he spoke. "When I was 7, my mother became a widow. My father died in an accident at a construction site. Then the men came. They were men who claimed my father owed them a great deal of money. They took every possession we had, down to the food in our kitchen. They would have taken our house, too, if my mother had not—" He paused, his jaw clenched tight. "She had to do things a mother should never have to do, just to keep a roof over our heads. I made a promise to myself that if I ever had power, I would not allow that to happen to another woman or another child." A lump formed in Juliana's throat. "So you are doing this for redemption?" "No." Adriano's voice was absolute. "This is a correction. Men like Gregor and Tommy are able to exist because good people do nothing, because they choose to look away. I do not look away." He reached inside his coat and produced a business card. "If anyone bothers you again, for any reason, you call this number. It does not matter if it is day or night. Someone will answer." Juliana accepted the card with a trembling hand. "I cannot. I cannot be in your debt. I cannot owe anyone." "You owe me nothing," Adriano cut in. "A mother fighting for her children is never a liability. It is the most vital work in the world." His gaze locked with hers, powerful and steady. "This is not charity, Mrs. Molina. You are not a debt to be paid. You are a person who has a right to live without being afraid. And I am a person with the ability to make sure that happens." Juliana could feel hot tears running down her cheeks. "I do not know how to thank you." "Do not thank me," Adriano said quietly. "Simply raise your daughters. Let them have the life they should have. That is the only thanks I will ever require." He started for the door but stopped. "This room is paid for 2 weeks. When that time is up, there is an apartment for you. The first and last months of rent are taken care of. It is in a very safe part of town. The schools are excellent." Juliana's breath hitched. "I cannot take that." "You can," Adriano said, looking back at her. "And you will, for them." And then he left. Juliana was left standing in the room, the business card in her hand as tears streamed down her face. From behind her, Chloe's little voice asked, "Mama, why are you crying?" Juliana turned and gathered both of her girls in a tight embrace. "Because we are safe now," she whispered into their hair. "We are finally, truly safe." 2 days had gone by since Adriano Silva had left room 212. For 2 days, Juliana had woken up in a comfortable bed. She had fed her children full meals. She had watched them play without constantly scanning her surroundings for threats. For 2 days, she had slowly started to believe that the long nightmare might have finally come to an end. She was at the window now, watching Chloe and Palmer in the little courtyard below. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and the girls were making a crooked snowman. The sound of their laughter drifted up to the second-story window. It was true laughter, the kind you only hear from children who know they are secure. Juliana rested her forehead on the cold window pane, her breath creating a small cloud on the glass. She had not laid eyes on Adriano since that morning, but she had noticed his men. There were different men each day. They always kept their distance, always watching over them. They did not approach or speak. They simply existed at the edge of her new life like silent protectors. Their presence should have felt threatening. Instead, it felt like she could finally take a full breath after months of holding it. A knock on the door broke through her thoughts. Juliana's body went rigid with instinct. It was a hard habit to break, but a glance through the peephole showed her it was only Rico. She opened the door. "Mrs. Molina," he said, holding up a set of keys. "The apartment is all set." Juliana just stared at the keys as if they were dangerous. "So soon?" "Mr. Silva does not like to waste time." Rico's face was professionally blank. "It is already furnished. The power is on. The refrigerator has been filled. The girls' room has bunk beds and a full set of toys." Juliana felt her throat close up. He considered every detail. He always does. Rico put the keys into her palm. "The address is on the keychain. As soon as you are ready to go, someone will be here to help with your belongings." "I have no belongings," Juliana said, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything I have in the world is in a single bag." Rico's jaw tightened for just a second. "Then someone will be here to help you with your bag." He started to leave but then hesitated. "Mrs. Molina, Mr. Silva asked me to give you a message." "What is it?" "He told me to remind you that protection is not charity. It is a correction." Rico's eyes met hers directly. "You did not do anything to deserve what happened. You are not taking advantage of anyone. You are finally being cared for in the way you always should have been." He was gone before Juliana could think of a reply. She stood in the open doorway, the keys pressing into her skin, and realized she was crying once more. They went to the apartment that afternoon. It was on the third floor of a clean, well-kept building. It was in a part of town Juliana had only ever passed through, the kind of place with large trees overhanging the streets and kids playing on the sidewalks. The Christmas lights on the houses looked expensive. It was the kind of area where she did not belong. But now, she did. Rico brought her one duffel bag up the stairs as Juliana held onto Chloe's and Palmer's hands. When he put the key in the lock and swung the door inward, both of the twins gasped. The apartment was lovely. It was not fancy or overdone. It just felt warm. There was a living room that had a plush couch and a television. The kitchen had a large refrigerator that was humming quietly. There were two bedrooms. One had a double bed and a dresser. The other held pink bunk beds and a toy box that was overflowing with dolls and animals. Chloe and Palmer shrieked with happiness and ran straight to their room. Juliana remained frozen just inside the door. "This is far too much," she whispered. "Mr. Silva would disagree," Rico said as he placed her bag near the couch. "But I am not able to." "You are able." Rico's voice was firm, but also gentle. "And you will, because those little girls need a stable home, and you need to have peace." Model. He paused at the door before leaving. "There is one last thing," he said, pointing to a small security panel near the frame. "This is wired directly into our system. If you ever feel threatened, if anything at all feels wrong, you push this button. Someone will arrive in less than 3 minutes." Juliana's eyes were fixed on the small device. "You mean, you are monitoring the apartment constantly?" Rico's face was unreadable. "Mr. Silva protects his assets. You are one of them now." And with that, he was gone, the door closing silently behind him. Juliana was left standing in her new living room, the sound of her daughter's laughter drifting from the other room. and she felt the crushing burden of the last 6 months finally begin to lift. That evening, long after the twins had fallen asleep in their new bunk beds, Juliana sat on her own bed, holding the business card Adriano had given her. It had only a phone number, no name or business, just a single connection. She traced the raised numbers with her thumb, thinking about the man who offered it. He was a criminal, a violent man, whose reputation alone silenced rooms full of tough men. Yet, he had rescued her. He did it not for personal gain, nor for gratitude or loyalty, but because he remembered the pain of watching his own mother endure hardship. Juliana shut her eyes, whispering into the stillness of the room, "Thank you." The words felt small and hollow, but they were everything she could offer. Miles away, in an office with a view of the city's dark streets, Adriano Silva was surrounded by stacks of folders. There were files on Gregor and Tommy, on every rogue collector in his domain, and on the widows and single mothers they had tormented, stolen from, and broken. He had been working for 48 hours without rest. Rico came in without knocking. "She is safe. The girls are content. No issues." Adriano gave a single nod, his gaze still on the papers. "What about the others?" Rico asked with caution. "The other collectors are being dealt with." Adriano's voice was like ice. "Every widow will receive restitution. Every fraudulent debt is being erased. Every man involved has a decision to make. Either fix what they broke or vanish. Some of them will make the wrong choice. I am counting on it." Adriano finally raised his head, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. "That is their problem, not mine." Rico paused for a moment. "Boss, what you are doing for her, for Juliana, this is beyond just correcting an error. You see that, do you not?" Adriano remained silent for a long while. Finally, he spoke. "When I was a boy, I saw my mother plead with men like Gregor and Tommy. I saw her tears. I saw her spirit shatter, and I was helpless to stop it." His hands clenched into tight fists on the desk. "I promised myself I would never be that powerless again. That if I ever gained the strength to stop men like them, I would use it regardless of the price. And Juliana. Juliana was a reminder of why I made that vow." Adriano's tone was low but unshakable. "She is not a charity case. She is not a debt to be paid. She is proof that my promise is still valid." Rico gave a slow, understanding nod. "The crew is asking questions about your protection of a widow. They wonder what she is to you. Let them wonder." Adriano's expression was cold. "If any of them have an issue with it, they can address me personally. None of them would dare. They all understood the consequences." As Rico turned to go, he stopped at the door. "For what it is worth, boss, I believe you made the right call." Adriano did not reply. He simply went back to his work, poring over files through the night, making certain that every woman victimized by Gregor and Tommy would be made whole. Power without a reason was simply brutality, and Adriano Silva would not be a brute. Not to those who were defenseless, not to mothers trying to shield their children, not to women who reminded him of the one person he could not save, his own mother, who passed away when he was 15. She died afraid, indebted, and broken. He could not save her. But he could save Juliana, and that would have to be enough. Spring came gently, washing the city in hues of green and soft pink. Juliana stood by the window of her bright little apartment, watching Chloe and Palmer play hopscotch on the pavement below. Their laughter, light and free, drifted up to her like a song. It was still hard to comprehend. 3 months had gone by since that cold Christmas Eve. 3 months of feeling secure. 3 months of breathing without fear. The apartment was from Adriano, but she had made it her own. It was a simple 2-bedroom on a quiet street, but it was spotless, warm, and above all, it was theirs. The security panel by the door had a soft green glow, a silent assurance that had transformed from a source of fear into a source of comfort. Juliana had secured a job, not a cash-in-hand cleaning gig, but a legitimate position with a proper paycheck at a flower shop 2 blocks from her home. Mrs. Gable, the shop's elderly proprietor, took one look at Juliana's gentle hands and weary but resolute eyes and offered her the job immediately. "You seem like someone who knows the value of precious, delicate things," she had told her. The twins were now in school. On their first morning, they had held tight to Juliana's legs, their faces pale with the fear that comes from too many abrupt nighttime moves. But that afternoon, they came home with drawings on construction paper and stories of their kind teacher, Miss Amy. Now they were always talking about friends and schoolwork, their lives expanding far beyond the confining walls of terror they had known for so long. It was a normal existence, a beautiful, ordinary existence, built upon a foundation of quiet, invisible protection. Juliana never laid eyes on Adriano, but his influence was present in the steadiness of her life. Rico would show up once a month, always on a Tuesday morning, with an envelope. It never contained cash. Instead, it held a gift card for groceries, a receipt for a paid utility bill, or a voucher for kids' clothing. "Mr. Silva's investments are paying off," Rico would explain in his flat, respectful voice. "He wants the profits to be distributed." In the beginning, Juliana had tried to decline. "I cannot continue to accept this. I am employed now." Rico had just looked at her, his face impassive. "The debt was never yours to carry, Mrs. Molina. This is not a repayment. It is restoration. Allow him this." And so, she did. With every week that passed, the tight knot of fear in her stomach loosened just a little more. One evening, while she was helping Palmer with a reading lesson, a story on the television news caught her attention. A well-dressed anchor spoke in serious tones about a major reorganization within certain unnamed business communities and a new initiative against predatory lending. The account was short on details, citing anonymous sources, but it noted that several figures had suddenly departed the city. Juliana's hand paused on Palmer's book. She did not need to hear any names. She understood. Later, as she tucked the girls into bed, Chloe gazed up at her with serious blue eyes. "Mama, is the scary man still looking out for us?" Juliana gently stroked her daughter's hair. "He is not scary, my love. Not to us. Is he one of our angels?" Juliana felt a lump form in her throat. "No, sweetheart. He is just a man who knows what it is like when people are mean. And he chose to make them stop." That night, after the girls were sound asleep, Juliana retrieved the plain business card Adriano had given her. She had never dialed the number, but she kept it safe in her jewelry box, a charm from the night her life split into two distinct parts, the time before and the time after. She thought of him then, not as the feared Mafia leader who commanded silence, but as the boy he must have been, a child who had seen his mother break, a man who had constructed a fearsome kingdom, only to use its power to shield a stranger and her girls from a terrible storm. It was a paradox she could never solve, so she no longer tried. Some accounts cannot be settled in a financial ledger. Some are paid in the tranquility of a safe residence, in the sound of children sleeping without fear, in the simple freedom of a mother who no longer has to glance over her shoulder. She moved to the window and gazed down at the quiet street. A black car was parked beneath a streetlight 2 blocks away. It was always there, a different vehicle in a different location, but its presence was constant. She no longer felt a shiver of fear at the sight. Instead, she was filled with a deep, humbling sense of gratitude. Adriano Silva had not offered her charity. He had returned her life to her. And in that act, he had repaired something within himself. It was not redemption, perhaps, but it was a piece of the powerless boy, now using his immense power for a purpose that was, in its own severe way, a kind of mercy. Juliana pressed her hand against the cool window pane. Somewhere out in the city, he was navigating the shadows, enforcing his own harsh rules. But because of those rules, 5 years had passed. The diner, a place of nightmares, was now a bright cafe with a glass front. Juliana stood on the sidewalk, holding the hands of her daughters. Chloe and Palmer were 10 now, their warm breaths clouding the winter air with excitement. "It is so different," Palmer observed, her voice strong and confident, not the timid whisper it once was. Chloe, always the old soul, added, "Everything is different when you are not afraid." Juliana held their hands tighter. This yearly visit was not about obligation, but about remembering. Life had become simple and good. Their apartment was a real home now, filled with the happy chaos of schoolwork, loud songs, and the messy evidence of a thriving family. Juliana ran the flower shop, and the smell of Christmas pine from that morning's wreaths followed her on her coat. Their family tradition was next. They were going for hot chocolate inside the very building where the diner used to be. A magazine at a newsstand stopped her. The headline read, "Silva Enterprises, the billionaire who builds cities." A blurry photo showed a man in a dark coat entering a vehicle. It was Adriano. He looked older, with silver hair at his temples, but his face was the same unreadable mask. Most people knew him as a mystery, a powerful man who reshaped skylines. Rumors said he also controlled the shadows, but Juliana knew him as the quiet that settled over a loud room, the intense stare that acknowledged her pain. He had refused to ignore her. He was why her children viewed safety as normal, not as a rare gift. "Are you all right, Mom?" Palmer asked, seeing where she was looking. "I am perfect," Juliana replied, and she truly was. They found a table inside the cafe, right where the dreaded corner booth had been 5 years earlier. While her daughters argued about whipped cream, Juliana remembered. She never used the phone number he gave her. But about 2 years passed, a pipe burst and flooded their home. She was overwhelmed, worrying about the money and the mess. Then a plain van arrived. A team of men quickly saved her things, removed the water, and fixed everything. The leader just said, "Mr. Silva sends his best." The bill they left behind had 2 words, balance zero. That was how he spoke, through decisive solutions, not empty words. It was protection, it was a correction. Their drinks came, piled high with cream. The girls' laughter filled the air, and Juliana gazed out at the cheerful street. The terror she once felt was gone, replaced by a deep calm. The person who stopped her torment was now the foundation of her peaceful life. Far away, in a glass tower above the city, Adriano Silva watched the lights. The holiday season was irrelevant to him. It was just another part of the world he controlled. Rico, looking a little older, walked in. "The yearly update on the Molina family," he stated, setting a single page on the desk. "Everything is stable. Finances, schooling, health. We see no threats." Adriano did not look back. He expected this. The reports were simply a routine. "Good. She owns the flower shop now. The children are in an advanced program. They visited the old location today. It is a cafe." Adriano gave a nod so small it was almost invisible. An image flashed in his mind, a desperate woman in a tired green coat, protecting her 2 small children. He did not act for thanks. He acted because of how the world truly works. The most basic rule is that the strong determine who gets hurt. On that evening, he made a choice that her suffering would end. It was a way to fix a very old wrong, to settle a debt from his own dark history. "Anything more, sir?" Rico inquired. "No." Adriano's voice was low and final, the kind that ended all discussion. "That is all." Rico departed. Adriano stayed by the window, a dark shape against the bright city. His kingdom was built on both legal business and raw violence. He was not a hero. He understood the price of his authority. Yet, somewhere in the city, a woman and her children were enjoying their drinks in a cozy cafe. They could laugh without nervously checking the entrance. They could talk about the future without being afraid. They were complete. For a man who built his life on power and control, this fact was his only true victory. He could never save his own mother. He could never undo his own past. But for one family, he had broken the chain of pain. He had become their shield against the night. He was not looking for forgiveness. That was for men with better pasts and clearer consciences. This was different. It was a statement. It proved that even a brutal man could draw a line. It showed that sometimes the most powerful act is to protect someone. As snow started to come down, it began to cover the city. It covered the old wounds, the bad memories, the shadow of what it was to be hungry. The snow made everything look clean and fresh. Juliana got her daughters ready to leave, their faces bright with happiness. When they walked into the beautiful, snowy evening, she did not look behind her. She only looked ahead, toward their home. The evening that started with a memory of terror ended with something else entirely. It was not a story of what she owed, but a story of absolute safety. It was a present from a dangerous man who, for a single moment, chose to be a protector instead of a predator. That night, a crime lord did not take a life. He saved one. In the peace that followed, a family remembered what it was to truly be alive. Here is the truth this story leaves behind. Sometimes the person who saves you is not the one the world calls good. Sometimes justice does not come from a courtroom or a badge. It comes from someone powerful enough to say, "Not her, not tonight." Juliana lost everything the day her husband died. She lost her home, her safety, and nearly lost her hope. But she never lost the one thing that mattered most: the courage to keep her children alive, even when she had nothing left to give. And in a world that had turned its back on her, one man looked at a trembling woman in a worn-out green jacket and made a choice that changed everything. If life has ever made you feel invisible, if you have ever wondered whether anyone sees your struggle, remember this: your fight to survive is never invisible to the right person, and the help you need may come from the last place you ever expected. If this story moved you, if it made your heart pound or brought tears to your eyes, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me, what moment hit you the hardest? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? I read every single comment, and I truly love connecting with you. If you have not subscribed yet, tap that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And please share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone. You never know whose life you might change with a single click. If you are ready for another emotional journey, go ahead and tap the next video appearing on your screen right now. I promise it will be worth every second. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and real value to our audience.